Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Michelle Fynan, and I'm here today as a board member of the OI Foundation. The mission of the OIF is to keep the OI community informed of all relevant studies, especially today's focus on the ORBIT study and the COSMIC study. And as you may know, the OIF receives financial support from many sources, including Ultragenyx and other pharmaceutical companies. And it follows the National Council of Health's standards of excellence in regard to providing a transparent accounting of where our funding comes from. And if you would like more information, please visit our website and click on our annual report. We aim to provide a platform for researchers to share their work with the OI community. I myself have OI, and both of my children do as well. So I'm also a member of the OI community, which adds another level of excitement for me about the discussion that I'll be monitoring and moderating today. And we hope that everyone finds today's session to be informative. I have with me Dr. Alison Skrinar from Ultragenyx to discuss their ongoing trials for OI. Welcome, Allie. It's so nice to meet you. I've heard wonderful things from all of your colleagues that I've had the pleasure of working with as well. And it's really just an honor to be here with you today to talk about these exciting trials that I know you've had so much power behind pushing them forward. So thank you on behalf of the OIF and the OI community. And I'd love to just say hello and give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, first of all, I would like to return the thanks to you for giving Ultragenyx the opportunity to talk about the OI program, who we are as a company, and how we are partnering with you and other patient organizations for the other disorders in our pipeline so that we can develop treatments that are most appropriate for the patients. So I am Alison Skrinar. I am a developmental child psychologist by training, and I specialize in motor and cognitive outcomes in children. However, I have definitely taken an interest in bone over the last several years. I've been with Ultragenyx almost since our inception, and I actually came to Ultragenyx having worked on the early clinical development program for Strensiq for hypophosphatasia, and I worked on our Crysvita program and from the very beginning. So that's my background in bone disease. And Ultragenyx, when we were starting the company years ago, I remember thinking this is a new company of very old veterans in rare disease drug development, starting with our CEO, Emil Kakis. And there's actually quite a few folks from the early days of development for rare disease who are actually at Ultragenyx now. So we certainly have a lot of experience with the development of treatments for very rare diseases. And as we've grown as a company, the one thing I will say is that our culture and our passion for including the patient community in the journey with us has not changed as we've grown. And that's one of the things that I'm proudest about with Ultragenyx. So it's been quite a wild ride over the last 13 years. So
beautiful. That's so beautiful. Yeah, and I can echo that as far as my experience in meeting with different people at Ultragenyx, just the amount of knowledge that is there. It's pretty incredible. And your culture is that supportive culture and just championing for rare disease is very evident in all of the people that I've met there as well. Can you tell me a little bit more about what Ultragenyx does for the rare disease communities that you work for?
So we currently have 10 programs in development, and we have multiple platforms. So we have gene therapies and antisense oligonucleotide, and we have monoclonal antibodies such as setrusumab. And so our desire is to bring novel treatments that attack the pathophysiology of the disease to address the unmet medical needs. So some of the diseases in our pipeline have palliative care or unapproved products that can be used to manage some of the associated signs and symptoms, but none that are directly attacking, targeting the physiology and changing the course of the distal use. So we are passionate about finding those diseases that don't have approved treatments and making a change in the lives of patients. So I think the patients are at the heart of the drug development process for us, which means that we want to choose outcomes that allow all of the stakeholders in the drug development process. So the patients and families and their physicians. So it's kind of a life beyond the regulatory authorities, making sure that we meet their needs, because we do need to do that in order to get drugs approved, but also making sure that our patients are getting a treatment that fits their needs. And that the physicians, that we produce data that allows a physician to make an informed decision about whether or not a particular treatment is right for their patient, so that they can actually present that data to the patients and families and make a recommendation for their treatment. And then, of course, someone has to pay for it, so we have to meet the needs of the payer community as well. But it all starts with the patients. And I will say that we involve the patient community very early in the drug development process, so we make sure we're focusing on the right things.
Wonderful. And we know that you have clinical trials focused on OI, but before we discuss those, can you share a little bit about just clinical trials in general? Because they're so exciting, but they're very new to our OI community. So how are they structured and how do they work?
So a clinical trial is essentially, an experiment that's designed to determine if a particular treatment, in this case, a drug, is safe and effective for the treatment of a disorder. So they are set up in such a way that we have to do it in a controlled environment. And so that's why there's a long list of eligibility criteria that you have to meet, and certain things that you can't have in order to participate. That is not designed to exclude anyone in the long run, but we have to do an experiment where it's very clear what the drug is doing to change the course of the disease. So if you have other diseases and other things going on, for example, for OI, if there's anything else that's going on with you that would change the condition of your bone, that keeps us from determining what setrusumab is doing for your bone. And so the intention is to do an experiment that answers that question, but it doesn't mean that the treatment would not work for someone who doesn't meet those eligibility criteria. It just means that that's the experiment that we're doing to answer the question about whether or not the drug is safe and efficacious. And so I think that's a very important thing to understand about clinical trials, is that they do have to limit the patient population that they're looking at, just to minimize noise in an experiment, so that you don't have other things that are keeping you from understanding what the drug is doing. And so the first stage of drug development is the phase 1 study, where you're actually looking at safety. For setrusumab, the asteroid study that was done in the adults gave us a lot of information about the safety of setrusumab, even though it had not been studied in the children. So the first phase of the ORBIT study actually allowed us to look at some very important clinical parameters to make a dose decision about how the children would be treated in the phase 3 portion, and also that's the dose that's being used in the cosmic study for the younger children. So essentially, it's a long process of gathering the information that builds on itself, so that you can ultimately determine if a drug is safe and efficacious. And so a phase 3 study actually allows you to answer that question about efficacy, because you're always monitoring safety, but you've determined what the right dose is and that dose is safe. You've done some preliminary efficacy work, and when you move into phase 3, that's really the real experiment, and it's often a controlled experiment. And sometimes those controlled experiments involve placebo, which, as you know, is a part of the clinical trial design for ORBIT.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for walking us through those different phases of the clinical trials. Like I said, it's new to our community, so even just understanding how that works is really helpful. So thank you. We'd love to hear about the 2 trials that you're currently working on for the OI community, who the studies are for, and maybe leaning into then how setrusumab can impact the body.
So the first study that we'll talk about is the one that I mentioned for the phase 2 component, where we determined that the 20 milligram per kilogram dose was the appropriate dose to move forward with in the phase 3 portion of the ORBIT study. The ORBIT study is looking at patients with types 1, 3, and 4. And a lot of the drug development, goes toward that particular segment of the patient population because it's the largest. So if you pull those patients together, they have the most similar clinical presentation. And what you want to do is have, kind of the most homogeneous group of patients that's diverse enough that you can determine whether the drug is effective for the bulk of the community. So that particular phase 3 portion of the ORBIT study is intended it's randomizing patients to receive either drug or placebo, and it's a 2-to-1 randomization. And what that means is randomization is kind of chance, right? Think of it as putting 3 pieces of paper into a hat and drawing from them. A 2-to-1 randomization says for every 3 pieces of those paper, 2 you will pick out, and that is the setrusumab, and the third one would be the placebo. So for every 3 patients, 2 people will end up in the setrusumab arm and 1 will end up on the placebo arm. The ORBIT study is intended to study children who are between the ages of 5 through 25, at which time you typically achieve peak bone mass. The COSMIC study, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on, is for the children who are younger. And so the primary endpoint in the study is looking at the annualized fracture rate. So what we do is patients are withdrawn from bisphosphonates. They're either randomized to receive setrusumab or placebo, and they're studied for a maximum duration of 24 months. Setrusumab is administered monthly as an infusion, and the patients are coming into the site monthly for their assessments. When they come in, it's a double-blind study, and what that means is that the patients and their families don't know whether they're receiving the drug or placebo, and neither do the physicians. And so what that allows us to do is a really blinded experiment where we can look and say, okay, nothing in this experiment was influenced by anyone's perception of whether or not they were on drug or placebo. So we know that they received the same type of care throughout. And we will be continuing, we have a data monitoring committee, so we'll be continuing to look at having an independent review committee evaluate whether or not we're able to stop the trial sooner. So the maximum duration in that study is 24 months, with the hope that if the efficacy does look good, that we can be advised by them to roll everyone over to the extension period earlier. And what happens in the extension period is that everybody receives drugs. So if you were originally randomized to receive setrusumab, you continue to receive setrusumab. And if you were randomized to receive placebo, you receive setrusumab. And that extension phase will go on until the drug becomes commercially available, should it be approved, and which is our goal. And when it does become commercially available, we have an ultra care team that helps patients secure a reimbursement for the drugs. So we do take care of the patients as they go through the process. And for the COSMIC study, that's intended for the children who are younger, and they are randomized 1-to-1. So that means you have a 50-50 chance of being randomized to be on your bisphosphonate regimen or to go on to setrusumab. And as with the ORBIT study for COSMIC, you do need to withdraw from bisphosphonates to participate.
Thank you for explaining all of that. We're really excited about these studies. Can you tell us a little bit about how setrusumab is different from bisphosphonates and just what it does inside the body?
So as we know, bisphosphonates are designed to prevent the bone resorption process. So bone is, I like to think of it as a ladder and scaffolding, and it's in a constant process of being broken down and built back up. And the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts are produced by the osteocytes, which are your bone cells. And so if you're trying to prevent bone resorption, you're trying to prevent those breakdown of the bone. And so that's what bisphosphonates are doing. So essentially they're increasing your bone mineral density by preventing the breakdown of bone. What setrusumab is doing is it is an antibody to sclerostin. Sclerostin is a protein that gets secreted by your bone cells. And so what that's allowing you to do is it's turning off this process. I like to think of osteoclasts and osteoblasts as being like a scale, right? So you're supposed to have this process where you're breaking down and building back up, and collagen, which we know is an issue in OI, is part of that process. So what we want to do with setrusumab is to help you build bone. So that's really the difference. Instead of breaking down, preventing, breaking down bad bone, we want to also build healthy bone. And so that is essentially what distinguishes setrusumab is, going from preventing the breakdown of bad bone to preventing that, but also activating the bone formation process, which would allow you to build healthier bone. So you would increase bone mineral density, but it would actually be healthy bone. And with bisphosphonate, there's still an issue, right? So we're preventing the breakdown, but it's still bad bone.
And so you mentioned that study participants must not be receiving bisphosphonates during the study. Can you explain a little bit more why that's necessary? Are there indications that taking bisphosphonates and setrusumab at the same time may be harmful? Like, what do we know as of now?
So we don't have any reason to believe that bisphosphonate in combination with setrusumab would be harmful to a patient in any way. In fact, there may be an opportunity at some point in a phase 4 study to look at whether or not they work well together. That is not the issue. The issue with doing these types of studies is if you are, as I mentioned before, if you have something that you're putting into your body that's affecting the condition of your bone, that prevents us from understanding exactly what setrusumab is doing to your bone. And that's the question. And so if we do have bisphosphonates on board, we don't know what's happening as a result of the bisphosphonate versus setrusumab. So when you think, for example, if you have bone mineral density, right, with DEXA, you know that your DEXA will increase, right? If you're on bisphosphonates, we talked about that being, kind of a production of or a function of the lack of breakdown of the bad bone, right? If we're able to increase bone mineral density, but it's because we're forming active bone, that's a different story, right? But we would not be able to distinguish between those two. So I certainly, we can appreciate the perspective of wanting to see if we can augment something that we're already doing rather than taking something we're already doing away. But that is the reason to answer the question about what specifically setrusumab does to the bone.
And these studies are looking at patients with OI types 1, 3, and 4. And those are the types that are really the most common types of OI. And you had mentioned that, but can you expand a little bit on why we aren't looking at all of the many different types that we have of OI?
So I would say that in these particular trials, we're looking at types 1, 3, and 4, and that does not mean that there wouldn't be an opportunity at some point to look at the others. And when we were talking about the phases of the trial, we talked about phase 1 and 2 and 3. There's actually phase 4 trials that allow you, after approval, to look at those segments of the patient population that you didn't study in your pivotal trial. As we know with OI type 5, the bone looks very different on X-ray. So if you think about doing a blinded experiment, you would automatically know if you were looking at X-rays who has type 5 versus who has, types 1, 3, and 4. So anytime you take patients that look different and put them into that pool, it introduces noise into the experiment. And so what we're trying to do is build on the results of Asteroid and expand that into children, extrapolate that to children to make sure that we can actually, we do believe we can do even better in children because they have an active growing skeleton and have not yet achieved peak bone mass. But that's just the beginning. We are committed to the OI community. And so there will be an opportunity to look at other groups of patients. So while I know it's frustrating, we face this a lot on our programs. So we are committed to the disease and not the type of the disease. It's just a function of how you do the experiment. If the other disease types look different, we would have to randomize differently. It would force us to do a bigger study. Those types are more rare. So if you think about, all the different complexities that go into adding way too many ingredients to the experiment, not being able to tease out exactly what setrusumab is doing. So we do the smallest study that we can that's generalizable to the broader population, recognizing that there are other subpopulations who do, potentially have the ability to benefit from the drug, and we are committed to looking at those. But this experiment needs to be building on the data from Asteroid for now.
You've shared with us about placebo. You've talked about randomization. Can you explain a little bit about the extension period?
So each one of the trials has an extension period where when the controlled portion of the experiment has ended, everyone will be treated in the extension period. So we will be having a group look at the data as we go, and they will be able to tell us if we can stop the experiment early and move into this extension period sooner. So what that means is if you have been randomized to stay on your bisphosphonate regimen in the COSMIC study or randomized to receive placebo in the ORBIT study, you will have access to study drugs. So the sooner we can finish the controlled phase of the experiment, the sooner everyone who participated in the trial can get access to study drugs. So if you were randomized to setrusumab, you stay on setrusumab. If you were randomized to a control arm, you get onto setrusumab. So the quicker we can enroll the study, the controlled phase, the quicker those folks who signed up for the trial can move on to the expansion period, where they know that they're getting study drug. And the sooner we can get the experiment going, the sooner we can file for approval should the drug look to be safe and efficacious, and the sooner we can get the drug on the market so that all patients with OI can have access to the treatment. So the goal is to just get through that controlled period so that in exchange for clinical trial participation, everyone knows that they're receiving drug and continue to receive the drug until it's commercially available. And then once it's commercially available, it becomes a treatment option to anyone else who feels and their physician feels that it's most appropriate for.
Thank you. And how do we learn more about participation?
I think the best way is actually through your organization, through OIF, because we work so closely and partner with you. You have access to the most up-to-date information. So if a caregiver or a patient is interested in participating, if they reach out to you, you've got all the ways to contact the appropriate folks within Ultragenyx who can help connect them with the clinical trial sites. So I think that as the liaison, we rely very heavily on you to make sure that you are able to get patients and their families in touch with the right folks at Ultragenyx to facilitate the process.
Perfect. Thank you. I know that patient feedback and insights were gathered as you were planning all of these trials, which is wonderful that the OI community was able to voice that. How did feedback impact what you decided to look at in these trials and just the big goals of the trial and other parts of the study, like how often people would have to go or transportation costs, things like that?
So we do work with the patient associations, but we also, Jenny's team and Christy and the advocacy group do hold leadership council meetings, advisory boards. And what those allow us to do is to take representatives for the patient community and actually to speak to caregivers themselves about what the most burdensome aspects of a disorder are. So that we know specifically what to focus on and what would be the most difficult aspect of actually participating in a clinical trial in terms of traveling, getting to the site, accommodations. And so that's all feedback that we take into consideration when we're picking our endpoints, when we are picking our eligibility criteria, when we're picking our sites, so that we can make sure that patients and their families are going somewhere where they feel comfortable, that the person who is actually helping to care for them during this time, which can be very, very stressful. And we do recognize that. We want to make sure that patients feel as though they are being cared for, that their health is being continually monitored, because the focus above anything else is their safety. And so it is difficult. One of the key learnings that we had from the OI community is how much home management of fractures there is. And so, of course, that becomes a problem when you have to have radiographic confirmation of fractures. And we have so much home management, which we completely understand, but that's the type of thing that you don't fully appreciate how much that's going on for the smaller breaks. And, we incorporated that. That's what led to the development of a diary where we're recording fractures, and then it triggers the site to say, hey, you put into your diary that you fractured, tell me more about that, so we can count all of the fractures. Travel to the clinical trial sites is difficult. Being on planes is difficult for patients and their families. So we do try to make sure that we have hotel accommodations, flight accommodations through an agency that coordinate all aspects of travel to and from the site for the visits. But we have learned a lot. And I think that we do recognize that clinical trials are burdensome, and we do work with the community. We cannot, we have to engage organizations to help us do that because we cannot engage with patients directly. But we also take feedback on the groups that we're using to help coordinate the trial accommodations. And, that's important for us to have that feedback, because if things aren't going well, then we can try to fix them.
Thank you. So with that said, who would your ideal candidate be in order to participate? You mentioned that certain types of OI are, who we're looking at here. So would a confirmed genetic mutation have to happen? Like, what needs to be in place in order to be considered an ideal candidate for these studies? And then on the flip side of that, are there any conditions that people should specifically avoid participating in the study if they have specific health conditions?
So there's a long list of inclusion criteria, but essentially we are looking for patients for both Orbit and Cosmic who are have been on bisphosphonate treatment for the Cosmic study, and they will have to withdraw from that, as I mentioned. So you have to be willing to come off of your bisphosphonate therapy. For the Orbit study, you have to be 5 through 25 years of age and younger, 2 through 6 on the Orbit study. You have to have confirmed OI type 1, 3, or 4. And, as I mentioned, you have to be willing to come off of the bisphosphonates. You can't have been treated with denosumab or growth hormone. Ideally, you have to be able to comply, and that means coming in for all the study visits. The exclusion criteria and the people who would not be eligible, that's something you have to discuss with your physician, but you do need to have, a good functioning cardiovascular system and renal function. And again, that's because we want to make sure that if we were to have an event, that we can relate it, we can determine whether it's related to the drug or not, and not to a comorbid condition. The exclusion criteria, I think anytime you're looking at a trial, they look scary. All the things that are listed in there are rare, but they're possible. So we need to make sure that we're not putting anyone at risk for something that's even a remote possibility. I think that one of the things that is key for these trials is having a history of fracture. And so we do need to know, if we're going to be looking at the impact of setrusumab on fractures, we need to have patients who have a certain number of fractures. As we've been screening patients coming into the study, the number one thing that comes up is the vitamin D levels. I think that, we don't in general get enough vitamin D, and so that can increase the risk of hypocalcemia, but that's something that's easily fixed with vitamin D supplementation. So I would say, in short, we do want to make sure that the patients do not have any comorbid conditions that can also affect the health of their bone, and making sure that patients have good cardiovascular and renal function. But that's definitely the case in any trial. You want someone to be not experiencing things that are going to prevent us from being able to assess the effect of the drug. But those are things that should be discussed with the physician. The investigator can go through that when they're doing the history to determine whether or not there's anything that would preclude screening for the study.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the adverse effects that have been noted?
We are not seeing a lot of adverse events that are associated with setrusumab treatment, which is great news. And that's what made us feel comfortable from Asteroid going into the children in Orbit, and then within Orbit going down to the younger children in Cosmic. And so everything is typically no different in terms of what we saw in the Asteroid study. So that's always, the ask when you're going into a clinical trial where you have data on adults, and you want to make sure that the doses that you're picking are most appropriate for children, and if there isn't anything different that's going on with the children. So we're doing well from a safety perspective and comfortable enough that we're going forward with phase 3.
So as a parent, I'm just thinking from that perspective of, if my child was on this trial and then all of a sudden they were to have a fracture or needed surgery, what would we do? Like, what would happen?
So if there is a change in the clinical condition of a patient, particularly the condition of their bone, there may be an opportunity to enter the extension phase earlier. That's a decision, but that is made by the investigator according to the terms that are outlined in the protocol. I think it's very important for patients and caregivers to understand that the trial investigator and the multidisciplinary team that's available at the site, they are first and foremost dedicated to your care and your safety. So if there are changes, their job is to detect them and to make an informed decision about continuing on in the trial. And as I mentioned, there are provisions within the protocol should there be a significant change in the condition of the bone, because we do believe that this treatment will be efficacious for changing the bone health of patients with OI, but drugs don't work overnight, and clinical trials are a commitment. So in order for us to figure out what setrusumab can and cannot do, we would like to see patients stay in the study so that we can continue to monitor it over time.
Thank you. So I know that you mentioned that we are currently in phase 3 for Orbit. I had said before that clinical trials are very new for the not the OI Foundation, but OI community as a whole. Can you give a brief overview? I know you mentioned them before, just how it goes, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. One more time for us, making it crystal clear.
Okay, so phase 1 is where we establish safety. Early phase 2 studies look at dose. So in the asteroid study, they did look at the dose that was most appropriate for the adults. We want to make sure that that's the most appropriate dose for the children. So the early part of the Orbit study looked at what is the appropriate dose for the children. So typically phase 1 studies are looking for safety. Phase 2 studies are looking for the right dose and dose regimen. Sometimes phase 1 studies are done with healthy volunteers. That's not typically the case in rare disease. And many rare diseases will do a type of phase 1/2, where they're looking at safety and dosing at the same time. So a phase 3 study is the controlled experiment. So once you know that you are appear to be safe and you know the right dose to treat, that's where you're doing your controlled study. So typically controlled studies, will involve a placebo, so you can answer the question in a blinded way. And that's the trial that leads to registration. So if you are able to demonstrate safety and efficacy at the end of that controlled period, patients roll over into the open label extension period. If you're, in an Ultragenyx study, and that data gets locked down and analyzed and then presented to a regulatory authority like FDA. And then FDA will review that whole package of all the safety and efficacy data from all the patients who have been treated. And then they can make a decision about whether or not they feel that that full body of evidence supports approval of that drug. And so that process does take time. And at which point, if it does become approved, that phase 3 trial, then the drug gets launched and becomes commercially available. And that's what allows patients who are not part of the trial to actually secure treatment. Phase 4 studies are if there are any segments of the population, like other types of OI, those can be studied in a phase 4 environment, which is done after approval. So what happens is if you were to treat other types of OI or a segment of the population that has not been studied, you can expand a label, right? So if you collect that data and it's telling you that this is appropriate for all patients with OI, then you can, or for example, if somebody says, well, you didn't study over age 25, we believe that we have adequate data from Asteroid to do that. If they wanted any type of additional study, that you could do in phase 4, expand the label, and then patients who don't meet the characteristics of those that were studied in the phase 3 study would then have access to treatment.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the clarity. And I think that Everything that you've shared today has just been so helpful as we go into this new direction for the OI community of what's possible. I think that it's just been a very hopeful discussion of, we're already here doing these trials, and there's a lot coming down the pipeline as well. And just so thankful to you for the work that you've done, and to Ultragenyx and everyone there that has made this happen. And I just appreciate so much of your work and what you've done for us today. Thank you so
We are
much.
appreciative to the patient community. As I mentioned before, this is difficult, and we're all wanting to produce the safest and most efficacious treatment option for those living with OI. And so if there is feedback, please let us know. Our job is to make this, as easy as possible, recognizing that it's difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Allie.
Thank you.